All right, so we've been following the life of David during our communion time, and yet last week we basically kind of got the lead up to the final battle, or the only battle, I guess you could say, between this rebellion. Children, do you remember who's the guy who's rebelling against King David, who's leading the fight against King David? Yes, Nathaniel. Absalom. And who is Absalom happen to be? David's son, right. So this is a very, very sad turn of events in the life of David. David realizes, though, that this is part of his, the consequences for his sin, for killing Uriah and committing adultery. So he understands that God is dealing with him in this way, and that explains his attitude about it. But nonetheless, David's been chased out of Jerusalem. Absalom has, as it were, taken control of the kingdom. And who remembers the two friends, or I should say the two guys who were there to give counsel to Absalom? Who remembers who they were? One guy he had a funny name. That's right, Ahithophel, and he was Bathsheba's granddaddy. We learned that going through, so that was an interesting connection. And he had turned against David. And then who is the guy who got sent back into Jerusalem for such an opportunity as this, to give counsel? You guys remember him? His name was Hushai, whatever you like to say it, and they had a little war conference. They all sat down at the war table, and Absalom said, "All right, gentlemen, what do you suggest I do?" And Ahithophel said, "We're going to do a sneak attack. Let me take 12,000 men. We'll go and surround your dad. He's going to be worn out. We'll go in. We'll just get him, and it'll all be over real quick." And Absalom said, "Okay, how about you, Hushai? What do you think?" And Hushai, what did he do? He gave Absalom this really grand plan. "Oh, no. Here's what you got to do. You got to go meet David in pitched battle. It's going to be really cool, really grand, really dramatic. And if, he gets into a city, we're going to take ropes and pull every rock down, and everybody's going to be, really impressed by you." Anyway, really, really awful counsel, but very sneaky counsel and very effective counsel. And the prayers of David were answered. He had asked that the counsel of Ahithophel would be defeated by the counsel of Hushai, and that's exactly what happened. So the setup was basically the end of chapter 17. David had gone into this town called Mahanaim, and Absalom had crossed over the Jordan, he and all the men of Israel with him. So there's this setup for a big battle that's going to happen. And that's where we are. We pick it up in chapter 18. It says, and David, I'm not going to read all that, but bottom line is, let's see here. We'll give you the setup. Okay, we'll read the first 4 verses. And David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai the son of Uriah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. Now, as we were reading this last night, it's very interesting. We've heard pretty much absolutely nothing about Joab until now. The last we heard about Joab is he was the one who helped get Absalom back in Jerusalem to try to get reconciled. It kind of looked like Joab was favoring Absalom potentially for a succession to the throne. And the last thing we hear about Absalom and Joab is a little thing called a fire in the barley fields. You guys remember that? Absalom was frustrated, and he set fire to Joab's fields so that Joab would be motivated to go get him an audience with David. So just keep that in mind. That's the last interaction we have between Joab and Absalom. So Joab apparently, though, has been with David the whole time. So he's remained loyal to David and is now in a position again of authority as one of David's generals. And then Abishai, you remember Abishai? He's the guy who's always wanted to cut people's heads off for David's sake. He's a mighty man. He's been very faithful, loyal general. And then the third guy is Ittai. And we had a little little cameo appearance with him a couple chapters ago. He's the foreigner who showed up to help David, and David said, go home. He said, no, I'd go anywhere with you, David. And here he is faithfully carrying out and protecting David. So they're going to lead these guys into battle against Absalom. Let's look at verse 4. Then the king said to them, to the people and to his generals, who's he talking to, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. All right, so remember that. All right, then I'm going to summarize. Oh, well, actually, no, it's too fun not to summarize. There's some good, there's some interesting phrases in here, but we have to read them. So the people went out into the field of the battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David. Now, when they're talking about the people of Israel, those are the folks who are with Absalom. So there's a battle. Absalom and company totally get trounced, which is what you'd expect from David and his mighty men, and then some, fighting against Absalom, who probably had no military experience, it doesn't appear. And anyway, they're totally defeated. And then it says that in verse 9, Absalom met the servants of David. So he's being chased by the servants of David, and Absalom rode on a mule. And the mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head, Absalom's head, caught in the terebinth tree. Now remember, if you remember earlier in the story, Absalom only cut his hair once a year. You guys remember that? He had nice, long, wavy, thick hair. And it was always really heavy whenever he cut it every year. So I don't think he'd had a haircut anytime recently. So he's riding his mule. It's really almost hilarious, right? I mean, it's like something straight out of a book, another book. And he's riding through the woods, and actually earlier in the passage it says that more guys got swallowed up in the woods than by the sword. So I think this is kind of like a miry tangle of, must have been in Texas, because this is how Texas is. I've been in there. You can die in those woods. So he gets caught. He's stuck. And it says he was left hanging between heaven and earth. I love that phrase. And the mule which was under him went on. So he's stuck. Mule keeps going. He's done. Now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, and this is the funniest sentence in the whole chapter, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. Okay, so children, let me ask you a question. If your mom and dad say to you before they leave to go somewhere, all right, kids, I want you to deal gently with your siblings. What do you think that would mean? If mom and dad told you to deal gently with them, what do you think that would mean? Not to be mean. Nathaniel, you got an idea? Don't beat him up. Be kind, right? Be nice. Take care of them. Make sure you don't hurt them. Okay, you all understand that? If that's what do you think it would mean something other than that? Like, I don't know, kill them? No, that's like the furthest thing from the instruction. Okay, so that's the order, that's the command that King David, the king, the rightful king, the rightful authority, has given to all his subordinates, to his generals, his captains, everybody. Deal gently with Absalom. All right, so let's see what happens. So Joab said, verse 11, to the man who told him, you just saw him, then why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life. For there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. Here's my main point from my main takeaway as we were discussing this yesterday. Did Joab obey? No. And if you look at the life of Joab, you will find this reoccurrence all the time. And actually, Michaela, we were talking, what do we learn about Joab from this story? And she summed up Joab's life with a simple statement. Joab could never trust his authorities. He could never trust his authorities. If you look at his life, when push comes to shove, Joab always did what Joab thought was best. Now, there were times when that sort of action lined up with what his authorities wanted to do, and there were plenty of times when it did not. But that didn't stop him. David had given clear commands to all his leaders that they were not to hurt Absalom. And Joab knew it. He even had a discussion with his own soldier about it. And I kind of get the idea that Joab really didn't want to keep talking about it. Like, he wanted to go get Absalom. But it's funny. It's like right after he gets reminded of the clear command, he's like, well, I can't talk to you anymore. I'm out of here. And Joab disobeyed because he could not and he would not trust the authority in his life. It's really ironic, isn't it? Here, Joab, who's supposed to be loyal to King David, he is as bad as Absalom. He totally disobeys. He totally rebels against authority. He takes matters into his own hands, and he does the very thing that he was told not to do. Now, you could ask a lot of questions. Well, was David right in wanting to spare Absalom? At this point, it didn't really matter. David was the king. It was proper and it was appropriate for him to issue commands. His command was not a bad command. If anything, I don't quite understand how the government functioned at that point, but he could have been captured and brought back and tried, as it were, for treason and rebellion and properly gone through proper course. But none of that happened because Joab took things into his own hands and figured, you know what? It's just better if we kill the guy now. And frankly, what do you think was on Joab's mind when this happened? I think his barley fields were on his mind. That's what I think. Because if you look at Joab's life, this guy held grudges, and he if you crossed him and you offended him, he would make sure you'd pay for it. I think that was part of his motivation. He realized that Absalom was not someone that he wanted to support anymore, and it was just going to be trouble, so he just went ahead and killed him. But it doesn't really matter what his motivation was. The bottom line is that he disobeyed. And ultimately, because he could not trust David, and really, big picture, whenever we can't trust an authority in our life, do you know who that means we're ultimately not trusting? Because where does all authority come from, children? From the authority. Who is the authority? God. Yes. God had appointed David as king, and Joab had the responsibility to honor God by obeying the king, and he did not do that. And the sad thing is, we don't know what would have happened had Joab honored God and honored the king and not killed Absalom. We don't know what would have happened. We don't know what sort of things might have occurred that would have been beneficial to the kingdom for reconciliation and restoration. We don't know. We'll never know. because Joab chose not to honor God. I was telling my wife last night that in some ways it reminds me of what happened in our own country. For a long time, you can have a debate about the Civil War and all the issues that started it and whatever and all that. But the fact of the matter is, if you know anything about President Lincoln, and you go and read his second inaugural address down at the Lincoln Memorial, Lincoln's attitude towards ending the war and the South, etc., was one of reconciliation. He wanted to bind up the wounds of the nation. He wanted, as it were, to deal gently with Absalom. And sadly, because somebody who did not fear God, who did not honor authority, chose to take something into his own hands because he thought he knew best and he thought that he was doing everybody a favor, he killed Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth. And the sad thing is we'll never know what would have happened had President Lincoln been in president for another term. We'll never know. I think, personally, that things would have gone much differently. I think we would have had a much more amicable reunification. And I think the long-term consequences that we experience in our nation today from that action, we're still feeling that. All right, so what does it have to do with communion? Jesus Christ came to save us in submission to the authority of his Father. Did you guys know that? And he talked about it all the time. From the very beginning, when he was 12 years old in the temple, children, what was he saying? What did he tell his earthly authorities? I'm here because I'm about my Father's business. And the cool thing is that even as a child, he still submitted himself to his earthly authorities for his heavenly Father's sake. And there came a time when he eventually came out and began his ministry, and he honored always his Father's authority, all the way until the Garden of Gethsemane, the pivot point where we see him wrestling with what is going to happen. And he comes to his Father and says, "Can you please take this away? Please take this away from me." And then says, "Your will be done, not mine." You see the ultimate submission to God, trusting his authority, his Father in heaven, that he would sustain him through this ordeal. And so, as we come to the communion table today, let's remember that ultimately God is our authority. And our first responsibility is seeking to trust him in what's going on in our lives. So